The night that changed Emily Carter's life began quietly in the city of Seattle, where the streets shined under soft rain and the cold autumn wind moved gently between tall buildings. Emily lived alone in a small but cozy apartment near downtown, a place she had carefully organized to match the calm life she had built after a difficult breakup 2 years earlier. She worked as a marketing manager for a growing company and spent most of her days focused on projects, deadlines, and meetings. Her evenings were usually simple: a warm meal, a book, sometimes a movie, and long, quiet hours where she could think without interruption. It was a safe life, predictable and peaceful, but sometimes the silence felt heavier than she wanted to admit. That evening, she sat near her window, watching the rain slide slowly down the glass while holding a cup of tea. The city lights reflected in the water on the streets below, and people hurried home under umbrellas. Emily had just finished a long work day and was ready for another quiet night when her phone buzzed softly on the table. She glanced at the screen without much interest, expecting a work email or a message from a colleague. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart paused for a moment. The message was from Daniel Brooks. She had not spoken to him in almost 6 years. Daniel had been one of the closest people in her life during college. They met during their second year at the University of Washington when they were assigned to the same group project. At first, they were simply classmates, but soon they became close friends. Daniel had a calm personality and a thoughtful way of listening that made people feel comfortable around him. Emily often joked that he was the only person who could keep her focused when her ideas moved too fast. They studied together in libraries, shared coffee during late nights before exams, and spent weekends exploring the city with their friends. Many people assumed they were dating, but they never crossed that line. Life after graduation moved quickly. Daniel accepted a job as an architect in Chicago, and Emily stayed in Seattle to start her career. At first, they promised to stay in touch, but like many friendships after college, the distance slowly created silence. Months turned into years, and eventually the messages stopped. Seeing his name on her phone now felt like opening a door to a part of her past she had almost forgotten. The message was simple. "Hi, Emily. I'm in Seattle for a few days for work. I was wondering if you'd like to meet for coffee." Emily read the message twice. She felt surprised but also curious. Memories of their friendship returned easily. She remembered how easy conversations with Daniel had always been, how natural everything felt when they spent time together. Still, she hesitated. Her life had been quiet and controlled for a long time, and reconnecting with someone from the past meant stepping outside that safe routine. She placed the phone on the table and stared out the window again while thinking about it. Part of her wanted to ignore the message and continue her peaceful evening, but another part of her felt something different, something that had been missing from her life for a while. After several minutes, she picked up the phone again and typed a short reply. "Sure, when and where?" Daniel responded quickly, as if he had been waiting. They agreed to meet that evening at a small cafe near the Seattle waterfront, a place known for its quiet atmosphere and warm coffee. Emily arrived a few minutes early. The cafe smelled of fresh espresso and cinnamon pastries, and soft music played in the background. She chose a table near the window and tried to calm the strange, nervous feeling in her chest. She told herself it was just a meeting between old friends, nothing more. A few minutes later, the door opened and Daniel walked inside. Emily recognized him instantly, even though several years had passed. He looked slightly older, of course, but his calm expression and relaxed smile were exactly the same. For a moment, they simply looked at each other before Daniel walked toward the table. "Emily," he said warmly, "it's really good to see you." She stood and smiled back. "You too, Daniel." They sat down and ordered coffee, and soon the conversation began flowing naturally, just like it had years earlier. They talked about work, about the cities Daniel had visited while designing buildings, about Emily's career, and the projects she enjoyed most. Time seemed to move faster than usual, while they shared stories and laughed about memories from college. The years between them slowly disappeared, replaced by the familiar comfort of their friendship. After nearly 2 hours, the cafe began preparing to close, and the staff gently reminded customers that it was late. Emily and Daniel stepped outside into the cool night air, and the waterfront lights shimmered across the dark water nearby. Neither of them seemed ready to say goodbye. Daniel looked at the harbor for a moment before speaking. "There's something I never told you back in college," he said carefully. Emily looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a breath and smiled slightly. I always wondered what would have happened if I had been brave enough to tell you that I liked you." The words surprised Emily more than she expected. She had sometimes suspected that Daniel felt something more back then, but hearing it now made the moment feel suddenly different. She looked at him thoughtfully before asking, "Why didn't you say anything?" Daniel shrugged gently. "I didn't want to risk losing our friendship." They stood quietly for a moment while the wind moved softly across the water. Then Daniel turned back to her with a small smile and said something that would quietly change the direction of the entire evening. "Would you like to have dinner?" Emily knew she could easily say no and return to the comfortable life she had built. But something about the night felt special, and something about Daniel's honest presence made her curious about where the moment might lead. She smiled softly and answered with the simple decision that would start everything. She didn't say no. Emily stood near the waterfront cafe for a moment, after Daniel asked if she would like to have dinner. The cool Seattle air brushing gently across her face, while the city lights shimmered over the dark water, and although her mind told her that she should probably return home and continue her usual quiet routine, something about the calm honesty in Daniel's voice made the moment feel different. So instead of stepping away from the possibility, she simply smiled and nodded, and that small decision led them to walk together along the softly lit street toward a nearby restaurant Daniel knew from his last visit to the city. The place was warm and welcoming, with soft yellow lights and quiet music that made conversation easy, and once they sat down at a small table near the window, Emily realized she had not felt this relaxed with someone in a long time, because Daniel spoke with the same thoughtful calmness she remembered from college, asking about her work, her life, and the small details most people never seemed interested in, while also sharing stories from his years working as an architect in different cities across the United States and Canada, explaining how each place had its own personality, and how designing buildings meant understanding the people who would live and work inside them. Emily listened with curiosity, occasionally laughing when Daniel described unusual moments from his travels, and the conversation flowed so naturally that she almost forgot how nervous she had felt earlier in the evening, while the waiter brought their meals and the warm smell of food filled the air around them. Yet even as they ate, the focus of the night remained their conversation, rather than the dinner itself, because the years apart seemed to disappear with every story they shared, and Emily noticed how Daniel still had the same quiet way of encouraging her to speak openly about her ideas, something that reminded her of late study nights during college when they would sit in the library discussing plans for the future as if life were full of endless possibilities. After finishing their meal, they remained at the table talking until the restaurant slowly grew quieter, and when they finally stepped back outside, the streets were calmer now, with only a few cars passing by under glowing streetlights, while a cool breeze moved through the city carrying the faint scent of rain, and Daniel suggested they walk for a while since neither of them seemed ready to end the evening yet, so they moved slowly through the downtown streets toward a small lounge Daniel had discovered earlier that day while exploring the neighborhood. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere felt peaceful with soft jazz music playing quietly and a fireplace warming the room, and they ordered coffee before settling into comfortable chairs near the window where the reflection of the city lights created a calm backdrop to their conversation. As the evening continued, their discussion shifted naturally from simple updates about work and travel to more personal reflections about life, and Daniel asked gently about Emily's past relationship, the one that had left her cautious about trusting people again, and although Emily usually avoided talking about that chapter of her life, she found it surprisingly easy to speak honestly with Daniel because he listened without judgment, simply nodding and giving her the space to explain how the breakup had changed her perspective on love and how she had spent the last 2 years focusing on stability rather than emotional risks. Daniel responded with understanding rather than advice, explaining that life often moved in unpredictable directions and that sometimes people needed time to rediscover what truly mattered to them, and Emily appreciated the calm sincerity in his words because he never tried to rush the conversation or push her toward any conclusion, instead letting the moment unfold naturally. Hours passed quickly while they continued talking about dreams they once had in college and how those dreams had changed with experience. And at one point, Daniel leaned forward slightly and admitted something he had carried quietly for years, explaining that when he first saw her message earlier that morning, he had felt both excited and nervous, because part of him had always wondered what might have happened if he had been more honest about his feelings back in college, and hearing that confession made Emily pause for a moment as she considered the possibility that their friendship might have held deeper emotions all along, emotions neither of them had fully explored at the time. She looked at Daniel thoughtfully and asked why he had decided to say it now after so many years, and Daniel answered with a small but sincere smile that sometimes life offered unexpected second chances, and he didn't want to ignore the opportunity to be honest, especially when meeting someone who had once meant so much to him. Emily felt a quiet warmth in her chest while listening, not because she suddenly expected a dramatic change in their relationship, but because Daniel's honesty reminded her of something she had been missing in her life for a long time: genuine connection without pressure or expectations. The lounge gradually emptied as the night grew later, and the staff dimmed the lights slightly while soft music continued playing in the background, yet neither Emily nor Daniel seemed aware of how much time had passed until Daniel glanced at his watch with surprise and laughed quietly, realizing that the evening had turned into something far longer than either of them planned. They finished their coffee and stepped back outside into the cool air where the city had grown calm and peaceful, and as they walked together along the waterfront path, Emily noticed how natural it felt to share the quiet moment beside him without needing constant conversation, because sometimes silence itself carried a sense of understanding. Daniel eventually stopped near a small park overlooking the harbor and turned toward her with a thoughtful expression, before saying that meeting her again had reminded him of how rare it was to find someone who made conversation feel effortless, someone who understood his thoughts without explanation. And Emily felt her heart beat slightly faster as she realized that the evening had become something more meaningful than a simple reunion between old friends. Yet instead of rushing toward any conclusion, she simply allowed the moment to exist as it was, standing beside Daniel while the wind moved gently across the water, both of them aware that the night had already changed something important, even if neither of them fully understood what the next step might be. The night had grown deeper over Seattle, and the waterfront was almost quiet now, with only the soft sound of waves touching the harbor and distant city lights glowing across the water, while Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks slowly walked along the path beside the pier, both aware that the evening had become far more meaningful than either of them had expected when they first agreed to meet for coffee. Emily kept her hands in her coat pockets as the cool wind moved through the street, but her mind was focused on the conversation they had shared inside the lounge, because Daniel's honest confession about his old feelings had awakened questions she had not allowed herself to think about for years, and although she tried to remain calm, she could feel something quietly shifting inside her heart, something that had been asleep since the painful breakup that changed her life 2 years earlier. Daniel walked beside her with his usual steady calmness, occasionally glancing at the water while respecting the thoughtful silence between them, and after a few minutes he spoke in a gentle voice that carried no pressure, simply curiosity, asking whether she regretted meeting him again after so much time had passed, and Emily shook her head immediately with a small smile, telling him that the evening had actually reminded her of how much she once enjoyed conversations that felt honest and effortless, because most people she met in recent years seemed rushed or distracted by their own busy lives, while Daniel still had the same quiet patience she remembered from college, the same ability to truly listen. They reached a small wooden bench facing the harbor and sat down for a moment while the wind brushed lightly through nearby trees and the reflection of distant lights moved across the dark water like gentle waves of gold, creating a peaceful atmosphere that made the conversation feel almost timeless. Daniel leaned back slightly and said that when he first arrived in Seattle for his work project, he never expected the trip would lead to seeing Emily again. But now that they were sitting there talking after so many years, he felt grateful for the unexpected chance to reconnect, because life often moved so quickly that people rarely stopped to appreciate the relationships that once mattered deeply to them. Emily listened carefully while thinking about her own path over the last few years, remembering how she had built a life focused mostly on work and independence after her last relationship ended badly, convincing herself that emotional distance was the safest way to protect her heart. Yet tonight, she realized that avoiding connection had also meant avoiding the possibility of happiness, something she had almost forgotten until Daniel appeared again in her life. She looked toward him thoughtfully and admitted that she had spent a long time trying to keep her life simple and predictable, because after experiencing heartbreak, she believed that strong emotions only led to disappointment, but tonight had reminded her that some moments were worth the risk of uncertainty. Daniel listened without interrupting, nodding slowly as she spoke, and when she finished, he said that he understood her feelings because everyone carried experiences that shaped the way they saw love and trust. But he also believed that people sometimes deserved a second chance to discover something meaningful when life unexpectedly placed the right person back in their path. Emily felt the quiet sincerity in his words and realized that Daniel had not changed as much as she first thought, because he still approached life with the same thoughtful honesty that made him special years ago. They remained on the bench watching the harbor for a while before Daniel gently returned to the topic that had lingered in the air since earlier that evening, explaining that his feelings back in college had never been dramatic or impulsive, but rather a calm admiration for the way Emily saw the world with creativity and kindness. And although he respected the fact that life had taken them in different directions, he had always wondered what might have happened if they had explored those feelings at the time instead of letting the moment pass quietly. Emily listened carefully while considering how strange life could be, because back then she had been so focused on building her future that she never noticed the deeper emotions Daniel might have felt, and now years later they were sitting together again in the same city where their friendship once began, discussing possibilities that had remained unspoken for so long. She smiled softly and told him that the evening itself already felt like a reminder that life sometimes offered unexpected opportunities, because she could easily have ignored his message that morning and continued her routine without thinking twice. But instead, she chose to meet him and allow the night to unfold naturally. Daniel looked at her with quiet appreciation and said that sometimes the smallest choices created the biggest changes in life, a simple decision to say yes instead of no. And Emily realized how true those words felt in that moment, because every step of the evening, from coffee at the cafe to dinner, the lounge, and now this quiet bench by the water, had happened because she allowed curiosity to guide her rather than fear. The city clock tower in the distance chimed softly, reminding them how late it had become, yet neither of them seemed eager to leave the peaceful moment behind, and Daniel finally stood while offering his hand to help Emily up from the bench before suggesting they walk a little farther along the harbor path. As they moved together through the cool night air, Emily felt a sense of calm confidence slowly replacing the guarded hesitation she once carried, because spending time with Daniel did not feel overwhelming or complicated the way some relationships had in the past. Instead, it felt steady and natural, like reconnecting with a part of herself she had forgotten. When they reached the end of the pier, they stopped again, and Daniel looked toward her with a thoughtful expression, before quietly saying that he did not expect the night to answer every question about their future, but he was grateful for the chance to reconnect, and hoped the evening might be the beginning of something meaningful, rather than simply a reunion between two people who once knew each other long ago. Emily felt the honesty in his voice, and realized that he was not asking for promises or rushing her into any decision. He was simply offering the possibility of rediscovering a connection that had always existed beneath the surface of their friendship. She smiled gently while meeting his gaze, and admitted that when he first asked her to continue the evening earlier, she could have chosen the safe option and ended the night after coffee. But instead she followed a quiet feeling that told her something important might happen if she stayed, and standing there beside the harbor, she understood that the feeling had been right, because the evening had already changed the way she looked at love, trust, and second chances, even if the full meaning of that change was still waiting to reveal itself in the days ahead. The night had grown quiet across Seattle as Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks slowly walked away from the harbor path, the cool wind moving gently between the buildings, while the last lights of nearby cafes faded behind them, and although the city was beginning to sleep, Emily felt more awake than she had in a long time, because something inside her had shifted during the long evening they spent talking, laughing, and remembering the past. When they reached the street near her apartment building, they paused for a moment beneath a soft streetlight, both aware that the night was finally reaching its end, yet neither quite ready to say goodbye. and Daniel looked at her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening, before quietly saying that seeing her again had reminded him of how rare it was to find someone who truly understood him, someone whose presence made time feel slower and conversations feel honest, and Emily felt a warm sense of appreciation as she listened because those words reflected the same thoughts that had been forming quietly in her own mind. For 2 years, she had lived carefully, protecting herself from emotional risks after a painful relationship that once made her doubt whether real connection could last. But tonight had slowly opened a door. She thought she had closed forever, not through dramatic gestures or overwhelming promises, but through simple moments of honesty and kindness that Daniel brought into every conversation. She looked at him thoughtfully and admitted that the evening had surprised her in the best possible way, because she had expected nothing more than a quick meeting between old friends. Yet somehow the hours had turned into something far deeper, something that reminded her how powerful genuine understanding could be when two people allowed themselves to speak openly without fear. Daniel smiled gently and said that sometimes life created strange timing, because years earlier they might not have been ready to understand what they meant to each other. But now, after experiencing different paths and challenges, they had both grown into people who valued honesty and patience more than anything else. Emily nodded slowly, realizing how true that felt, and she explained that during the last 2 years she had spent so much energy building walls around her heart that she forgot how meaningful it could be to simply trust the moment and allow life to unfold naturally. And Daniel listened quietly before saying something that stayed with her long after the night ended, telling her that courage did not always mean making big decisions or dramatic changes, but sometimes meant allowing yourself to feel something again, even when you once promised never to risk your heart. Those words made Emily smile softly, because she knew that was exactly what had happened during the evening. She had allowed herself to stay present instead of retreating into safety, and that small decision had quietly changed the direction of her thoughts about love and connection. The street around them remained calm while distant traffic moved through the city like soft echoes, and Daniel eventually asked whether she would like to meet again before he left Seattle later in the week, his voice carrying hope but also respect for whatever answer she might give. Emily thought about the question carefully, remembering how earlier that night she had faced a similar moment when he invited her to continue the evening after coffee, and once again she realized that life was offering her a choice between returning to the comfortable routine she knew or stepping forward into something new that might hold real meaning. Instead of hesitating, she looked directly at Daniel and smiled with quiet confidence, telling him that she would like that very much, because the truth was, she felt happier during those few hours than she had felt in a long time. Daniel's expression brightened with relief and appreciation, and he thanked her simply for being open to the possibility, explaining that he never expected immediate answers about the future, but believed that meaningful connections deserved the chance to grow naturally. Emily appreciated his patience more than he realized, because it removed the pressure she once feared in relationships, replacing it with a sense of calm trust that made everything feel easier. After a final moment of conversation, they slowly said goodnight, Daniel promising to call her the next day, while Emily stepped inside the entrance of her building and watched him walk down the quiet street under the soft glow of streetlights. As she rode the elevator up to her apartment, she felt a peaceful warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with excitement or uncertainty, but everything to do with the quiet realization that her life had gently shifted direction during the past few hours. When she entered her apartment, the room looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening. The same window overlooking the city lights, the same quiet space she had filled with books and comfortable routines, yet something inside her had changed because the silence no longer felt heavy or lonely. Instead, it felt full of possibility. She placed her coat near the door and walked to the window where the rain had started again, watching small drops slide slowly down the glass while thinking about everything that had happened during the night, from the first message Daniel sent that morning to the final conversation beneath the streetlight outside her building. What amazed her most was how simple the turning point had been, not a dramatic declaration or sudden event, but a quiet choice she made without fully realizing its importance at the time, the moment when Daniel invited her to continue the evening and she decided not to say no. That single decision had opened the door to a night filled with laughter, honest memories, and the rediscovery of feelings she once believed were gone forever. And standing there by the window, Emily finally understood why the evening felt so significant. Because it reminded her that life sometimes changed, not through grand plans, but through small acts of courage when someone allowed themselves to follow a moment instead of turning away from it. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was probably walking back to his hotel, thinking about the same unexpected reunion and the quiet hope that came with it. And Emily realized that regardless of what the future might bring, the night had already given her something valuable, the reminder that her heart was still capable of trusting again. She smiled gently while looking out at the glowing city lights and whispered a quiet thought to herself, understanding at last that the night truly had changed everything, not because it promised a perfect future, but because it showed her that love, when it arrived with patience and honesty, could still find its way into a life that once believed it was safer to live without it.